The air brake hissed like a dying animal, and I knew we were finished. It was 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, and the temperature had dropped to 23 degrees in the rail yard outside Cheyenne, Wyoming. Frost covered every surface of the SD-70AC locomotive that had just died in the middle of our yard, blocking 3 active lines and holding up a grain shipment worth $2 million. My radio crackled with the voice of dispatch, asking for an update I couldn't give, and I could feel the eyes of my crew on me, waiting for the decision that would either save us or cost me my job. I'd been a yard supervisor for Union Pacific for 17 years. I knew diesel engines the way some men knew their wives, every sound, every vibration, every smell that meant trouble. But this wasn't a normal failure. The engine had shut down mid-operation, all the diagnostic panels had gone dark, and the emergency systems weren't responding. My lead mechanic, Ray Kowalski, had his head buried in the electrical cabinet, swearing under his breath in a mixture of English and Polish that meant he was genuinely stumped. "Talk to me, Ray," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was hammering. "Nothing makes sense, Tom." He pulled his head out, his face red from exertion and cold. "The main circuit breaker's fine, the alternator's good, fuel pumps are operational. It's like the whole computer system just decided to take a vacation." Behind me, the rest of the crew stood in a semicircle. Marcus, our newest hire, still learning the ropes. Old Jimmy Ortega, who'd forgotten more about trains than most people would ever know. And Brad Hutchins, the company's regional troubleshooter, who'd driven up from Denver specifically for this shipment. Brad's presence made everything worse. He wasn't just observing, he was evaluating. One more failure, and my position would be restructured, which was corporate speak for fired. "We need to call in a full diagnostic team from the shop," Ray said, wiping grease off his hands. "This is beyond field repair." "That'll take 6 hours minimum," Brad said, checking his watch. "The grain contract has a penalty clause that kicks in at noon. We're talking about $100,000 every hour past deadline." I did the math. 6 hours would put us at nearly 11 a.m., cutting it dangerously close. And that was if everything went perfectly, which it never did. That's when I saw her. She'd come around the corner of the maintenance shed, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that said she belonged, even though I'd never seen her before. She was young, mid-20s maybe, wearing a worn Carhartt jacket and work boots that had seen actual work, not the fashion statement kind. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she carried a toolbox that looked like it had been inherited rather than bought new. "Who the hell is that?" Marcus asked. She walked directly toward our locomotive, not hesitating, not asking permission. There was something in her eyes as she approached, a kind of focused intensity that made me immediately defensive. I'd seen that look before on young engineers fresh out of technical school, full of theoretical knowledge and absolutely no understanding of how things worked in the real world. "Miss, this is a restricted area," I called out, stepping to block her path. "Authorized personnel only." She stopped, but her eyes never left the locomotive. "I know what's wrong with it." Ray let out a bark of laughter. "Oh, you do? And how would you know that?" "The sound it made when it shut down, and the way the exhaust stack is still pinging." She tilted her head, listening to something I couldn't hear. "It's the ECM, the engine control module, probably a corrupted firmware update." I felt my jaw tighten. I'd spent 3 decades around locomotives, and here was this kid acting like she could diagnose a complex electrical failure from 50 feet away. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice professional. "I appreciate the enthusiasm, but we've got certified mechanics handling this. If you're looking for the hiring office, I'm not looking for the hiring office." Her voice was calm but firm. "I'm telling you what's wrong with your locomotive." Brad stepped forward, his expression somewhere between annoyed and curious. "And you are?" "Casey Morrison." The name meant nothing to me, but I saw something flicker across Jimmy's face. You need to leave, I said flatly. This is company property and we've got work to do. Ray, Marcus, let's strip down the control systems and see if we can find— You're wasting time, she interrupted. Every minute you spend tearing apart those panels is another minute that ECM is sitting there with corrupted code, and you can't fix that with a wrench. I felt heat rising in my chest. I'd had enough of know-it-alls who thought they could waltz into my yard and tell me how to do my job. Listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice dropping to the tone I used when I wasn't going to repeat myself. I don't know who you are or what you think you know, but this is my rail yard, and these are my locomotives. Now, I'm asking you politely one more time to leave before I have to call security. She held my gaze for a long moment. I expected her to argue, to push back, to do what every young hotshot did when their authority was challenged. Instead, she did something that surprised me. She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly this response. 5 minutes, she said quietly. Give me 5 minutes, and I'll have it running. Ray scoffed. 5 minutes, lady. We've been working on this for 45 minutes, and we haven't even found the problem yet. That's because you're looking in the wrong place. She shifted her toolbox to her other hand. The ECM is under the long hood, access panel 3. You need to pull the module, connect it to a laptop with the right diagnostic software, reflash the firmware from a backup and reinstall. 5 minutes if you know what you're doing. It was specific enough to be plausible, but I'd learned a long time ago that confidence wasn't the same as competence. The rail yard was full of people who could talk a good game. Tom, Jimmy spoke up for the first time, his voice careful. Maybe we should— No, I cut him off. I pointed at my crew. We're going to solve this the right way, with certified procedures and proper documentation. Not with some random person off the street who thinks they know better than trained professionals. I turned to Casey. I'm not going to ask again. Leave now. She studied me for another moment, and I saw something in her expression that I couldn't quite read. Disappointment, maybe, or a kind of weary resignation that seemed too old for her face. Okay, she said simply. Then she turned and walked back toward the maintenance shed, her boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. Ignore that girl, I told my team, pulling my attention back to the locomotive. Let's focus on what matters. Ray, I want you to start with the electrical— Tom, Marcus interrupted, his voice strange. Tom, look. I turned to see Casey standing at the base of the locomotive. She hadn't left. Instead, she'd circled around to the other side of the engine, and she was already climbing the access ladder with her toolbox. Hey! I shouted, starting toward her. I told you to! But she was already moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from doing something 1,000 times. She pulled open access panel 3, set her toolbox on the catwalk, and began working. Someone get her down from there, I barked, but even as I said it, I saw her hands moving with absolute certainty. She wasn't fumbling or guessing. She pulled out the ECM, a black box about the size of a hardcover book, connected it to a laptop she'd produced from her toolbox, and her fingers flew across the keyboard. 90 seconds had passed. This is insane, Brad muttered beside me. If she breaks something, she won't break anything, Jimmy said quietly. There was something in his voice that made me look at him sharply, but his eyes were fixed on Casey. 2.5 minutes. She disconnected the laptop, reinstalled the ECM, closed the panel, and climbed down the ladder. When her boots hit the gravel, she dusted off her hands and looked at me. Try it now, she said. I wanted to tell her she was crazy. I wanted to explain why what she'd just done couldn't possibly work. But Ray was already climbing into the cab, and I heard the startup sequence initialize, the familiar whir of systems coming online, the deeper rumble of the engine turning over. The locomotive roared to life. 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The diesel engine settled into its normal idle, All the control panels lit up green, and through the window I could see Ray staring at the diagnostics display with his mouth open. "I'll be damned," Marcus whispered. Casey picked up her toolbox. The firmware update got interrupted halfway through the download. Probably a network glitch or power fluctuation. It happens more than people realize with these newer computer-controlled systems. The solution's in the technical bulletin from 3 months ago, but most crews don't read those unless there's a mandatory safety directive attached. She started walking away again, and this time I found myself moving after her. "Wait!" I called out. "Just wait a second." She stopped, but didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her expression was neutral, professional, like we were strangers making small talk at a bus stop. "Where did you learn to do that?" I asked. "Same place everyone learns. Time, experience, and paying attention to the details everyone else ignores. No, I mean, who trained you? What company?" For the first time, I saw something like emotion crack through her composure. "You really don't remember me, do you?" The question hit me like cold water. I studied her face, trying to place her, and then I saw it, the shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw. It was familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. "Morrison," Jimmy said from behind me. "Tom. She's Jack Morrison's daughter." The name landed like a punch. Jack Morrison, my mentor, the man who'd taught me everything I knew about locomotives, who'd saved my career twice and my life once. Jack, who died 4 years ago from a heart attack in this very rail yard. Jack, who talked about his daughter constantly, the one studying mechanical engineering, the one who was going to revolutionize the industry, the one he'd been so proud of that it made the rest of us tired of hearing about her. "You're Jack's—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Daughter, yes." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tightness in it. "I applied for a position here 3 years ago, right after I graduated. You interviewed me yourself. Do you remember what you told me?" I didn't. I honestly didn't remember. I'd done hundreds of interviews over the years. "You said that railroad work was hard, that it wasn't suitable for someone like me, and that I should consider a different career path. Something in an office, maybe. Something cleaner." She adjusted her toolbox. "You never called me back. Neither did the 4 other rail yards I applied to. Same answer everywhere. Too young, too inexperienced. Wrong fit for the culture." Each word was precise, factual, delivered without anger, but with a weight that made me feel like I was shrinking. "I've been working freelance ever since," she continued. "Small repairs, independent contractors, anyone who'll hire me. I heard about your problem on the scanner, thought maybe I could help. Guess I was wrong about that last part." She turned to leave again, and this time I let her go. I watched her walk across the rail yard, past the office buildings and out toward the parking lot where a beat-up Ford pickup was waiting. She loaded her toolbox into the bed and climbed into the cab, and I stood there like an idiot, unable to move, unable to think of a single thing to say. The locomotive continued to idle behind me, running perfectly, fixed in less than 5 minutes by someone I'd told my team to ignore. Brad cleared his throat. "Well, that was interesting." "Tom," Ray said carefully, "did you really not recognize her?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because the truth was worse than not recognizing her. The truth was that I'd looked at her and made a dozen assumptions in the space of 3 seconds. Too young, too female, too confident, too different from the weathered men who usually populated my crews. I'd looked at Jack Morrison's daughter, the one he'd been so proud of, the one he'd trained himself, and I'd told her to leave. The radio crackled. "Yard control to Supervisor Hayes. We show the SD-70 ACE is back online. What's your status?" I pulled the radio from my belt, my hand shaking slightly.
"Status is operational. Problem resolved." That was fast. What was the issue? I looked at my crew. Ray was avoiding my eyes. Marcus was staring at the ground. Jimmy was watching me with an expression that might have been disappointment, or might have been something worse, pity. Corrupted ECM firmware, I said into the radio. We'll file the full report. Copy that. Good work.
Good work. The words tasted like ash. I watched Casey's truck pull out of the parking lot, her taillights disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. The grain shipment would leave on time. The company would save their penalty fees. Brad would report that I'd handled the situation efficiently. By every metric that mattered to the people who signed my paycheck, this morning had been a success. But standing there in the cold, watching the spot where she disappeared, I felt like I'd just failed a test I hadn't known I was taking. And the worst part was that I still didn't fully understand what I'd done wrong. I just knew that Jack Morrison would have been ashamed of me, and I was starting to realize that I should be ashamed of myself. The coffee in the break room tasted like dirt, but I drank it anyway. It was 7:15 a.m., and I'd spent the last 2 hours going through the motions of my job while my mind kept circling back to Casey Morrison's face. That careful neutrality when she'd asked if I remembered her, the way her hands had moved with absolute confidence across that ECM, the quiet dignity with which she'd left after I'd dismissed her. "You look like hell," Ray said, dropping into the chair across from me. He'd showered and changed into clean coveralls, but there were still grease stains under his fingernails. 26 years he'd been working on locomotives, and he prided himself on being able to diagnose anything by sound alone. This morning, a 20-something woman had done in 5 minutes what he couldn't do in 45. "Just tired," I said, not meeting his eyes. "Yeah, well, that was something else out there." He stirred his coffee with more force than necessary. "Jimmy says she's Jack Morrison's kid." That's what he said. Jack used to talk about her all the time. Always had pictures of her on his phone, her graduation, some award she won, projects she was working on. Ray paused. He was real proud of her. Said she had the gift, you know, that thing where you just understand machines on a level most people never get to. I stared into my coffee cup. I don't remember interviewing her. That was 3 years ago. You did what, 40 interviews that season? 37. I remembered because it had been a particularly frustrating hiring cycle. We only ended up offering positions to 4 people. None of them women. The statement hung in the air between us. It wasn't an accusation exactly. It was just a fact, delivered in Ray's matter-of-fact way that somehow made it worse than if he'd been angry. "We hire based on qualifications," I said, hearing the defensiveness in my own voice. "Experience, certifications, references, and culture fit." Ray finished for me. "That's what you always say, has to be the right fit for the team." "Yes. And what exactly does that mean, Tom?" Ray leaned forward. "Because I've been on this team for a long time, and I've noticed that culture fit seems to have a pretty specific look to it." "That's not fair, isn't it?" Ray's voice hardened. "We've got one woman in the entire maintenance division, Linda Chen, in the office, and she fights for every ounce of respect she gets. You think that's an accident? You think qualified women just aren't applying?" I wanted to argue, but the words stuck in my throat. Because I knew Ray was right, at least partially. The railroad industry was overwhelmingly male, and it had been for as long as I'd been in it. That's just how it was. That's how it had always been. But knowing something was tradition didn't make it right. "I should have recognized her," I said finally. "Jack showed me pictures. He talked about her constantly. I didn't connect the pieces." "Because you weren't looking for them," Ray said quietly. "You saw a young woman walking toward your locomotive with confidence, and your brain put her in a category that didn't include legitimate expert. That's on you, Tom. That's something you gotta own." The door to the break room opened, and Brad walked in, his phone pressed to his ear. He was nodding and making affirmative sounds, and when he finally hung up, he looked directly at me. "Good news," Regional management is pleased with how this morning went. Quick resolution, minimal downtime, no safety incidents. They want a detailed report on the diagnostic process. Sure, I said. I'll have it on your desk by end of day. Make sure you document the firmware issue. If it's happening with one unit, it could be systemic across the fleet. Brad poured himself coffee. Also, they're asking who diagnosed it so quickly. They want to know if it's something we can replicate for training purposes. I felt my chest tighten. This was the moment where I could be honest, where I could give credit, where it was actually due. But the words felt heavy and complicated, wrapped up in shame and ego and the sudden awareness of my own biases. It was a team effort, I said, which was technically true if you counted telling someone to leave as being part of the team. Ray did most of the diagnostic work. Ray's head snapped up, his eyes meeting mine with something close to betrayal. But he didn't contradict me. Not there. Not with Brad in the room. Well, good job, Brad said. Keep up the good work. After Brad left, Ray stood up without a word and dumped his coffee in the sink. He walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back to face me. You know what the worst part is, he said. It's not that you dismissed her. It's not even that you didn't recognize her. It's that you're still doing it right now. You just took credit for her work, and you're going to write a report that erases her from the story completely. Jack Morrison's daughter fixed that locomotive, Tom. She did it in 5 minutes after you told her to leave, and you can't even give her that. You can't even say her name. He left, and I sat alone in the break room with my bad coffee and my worse conscience. By noon, the story had spread through the rail yard. I heard different versions from different people. Some said a random woman had wandered onto the property and fixed the locomotive by accident. Others said it was a disgruntled former employee trying to prove a point. A few claimed it was an industrial spy from BNSF Railway trying to steal proprietary information. None of the versions I heard were accurate. None of them included Casey Morrison's name or gave her actual credit for what she'd done. The story had already been processed through the rumor mill and stripped of anything that might challenge the established order of things. I spent the afternoon in my office, supposedly writing the diagnostic report, but mostly staring at my computer screen. I pulled up the interview records from 3 years ago and found Casey's application. Her resume was impressive. Mechanical engineering degree from Colorado School of Mines, summa cum laude, internships with Caterpillar and GE Transportation, specialized coursework in diesel-electric locomotive systems. Her references included 2 professors and her father, Jack Morrison, veteran locomotive engineer. I remembered the interview now, not the details, but the feeling of it. She'd been confident. Maybe too confident. She talked about modernizing maintenance procedures, about predictive diagnostics and computer-controlled systems, about changing the culture of the industry. She'd been 22 years old and full of ideas, and I'd looked at her and seen naivety. I'd seen someone who didn't understand how things really worked, but this morning she'd proven that she understood exactly how things worked. Better than I did, better than my whole crew did. And I'd told her to leave. My phone rang. The caller ID said J. Ortega. Jimmy, I answered. Tom, you got a minute? I'm down in the archives and I found something you should see. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the dusty basement office where we kept old maintenance logs and personnel records. Jimmy had several file boxes spread across a table, and he was flipping through papers with the methodical patience of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Jack's files, Jimmy explained. I helped box them up after he died. Been meaning to go through them properly, make sure nothing important got lost in the shuffle. He pulled out a folder. Found this. It was a training manual, handwritten, titled Locomotive Maintenance for the Next Generation. Jack's handwriting unmistakable. Inside were detailed notes, diagrams, troubleshooting flowcharts, a comprehensive guide that went far beyond the standard company materials. He was writing this for her, Jimmy said. For Casey. Started it when she was in high school, kept adding to it all through her college years. He was training her, Tom, systematically. Everything he knew, he was passing it down to her. I flipped through the pages. The detail was extraordinary. Sections on electrical systems, hydraulics, computer diagnostics, even notes on dealing with difficult supervisors and workplace politics. On one of the last pages, in Jack's distinctive scrawl, "The hardest part isn't learning the machines. It's proving to people that you belong. They'll doubt you because you're different from them. Don't let that doubt become your own. You know your worth. Make them see it." He knew, I said quietly. He knew she'd face resistance. Of course he knew. Jimmy closed the folder carefully. Jack came up in a time when this industry was even more closed-minded than it is now. He saw what happened to anyone who didn't fit the mold. That's why he pushed her so hard, trained her so thoroughly. He wanted her to be undeniable. And I denied her anyway. Jimmy didn't respond immediately. He pulled out another document, a letter of recommendation Jack had written for Casey's application to Union Pacific. The date was 3 years ago, right around the time I'd interviewed her. "I want to read you something," Jimmy said and began. "Casey Morrison is the most naturally talented locomotive engineer I have encountered in 41 years of railroad work. She possesses not only technical knowledge, but something rarer, an intuitive understanding of how these machines think, if such a word can be applied. She can diagnose by sound what others need computers to tell them. She can anticipate failures before they occur. She has the gift that separates competent mechanics from truly exceptional ones. I understand that her age and gender may raise concerns about culture fit. I'm asking you to look past those surface factors and see the engineer underneath. The railroad industry is changing. The locomotives are more complex, more computerized, more demanding of technical expertise. We need people like Casey if we're going to keep up with that change. She's my daughter, yes, but I would recommend her just as strongly if she were anyone else's daughter or son. Talent is talent, regardless of who possesses it. I hope you'll give her the chance I know she'll earn." Jimmy folded the letter and set it down gently. "You interviewed her 6 days after Jack died, Tom. Did you know that?" I felt my stomach drop. "No, I didn't. Heart attack right here in the yard. She was supposed to start working here that summer. Jack had it all arranged, was going to personally oversee her training. Then he died, and she showed up to her interview grieving her father, trying to hold it together, hoping that the place he'd loved would give her a chance to honor his memory by following in his footsteps. Jesus Christ. And you told her it wasn't suitable for someone like her, that she should find something cleaner, safer, more appropriate." I sat down heavily in the nearest chair. I remembered it now, not clearly, but in fragments. A young woman with red eyes, her voice steady but strained, the way she'd talked about her father's legacy, about wanting to continue his work. How I'd thought she was being emotional, using her grief to try to guilt me into hiring her. How I'd decided she wasn't tough enough for the work. "I didn't know," I said weakly. "You didn't ask," Jimmy corrected. "You didn't ask about her training, her experience, her qualifications. You made up your mind in the first 30 seconds, and the rest of the interview was just you going through the motions. That's not," I started, but I couldn't finish, because it was true. I'd made up my mind the moment she walked into my office, young and grieving and female, and nothing she could have said would have changed it. "So what do I do now?" I asked. Jimmy looked at me for a long moment. "That's not really my question to answer, Tom, but if you're asking for advice from an old man who's made his share of mistakes, I'd say start by telling the truth about what happened this morning, about who fixed that locomotive, about why you didn't recognize her, then figure out how to make it right. And if I can't, then at least you'll know you tried, which is more than you've done so far." I left the archives with Jack's training manual under my arm and a weight in my chest that felt like it might never lift. The afternoon shift was ending, the rail yard bustling with activity as crews switched over and new locomotives rolled in from long-haul runs. I'd walked through this space thousands of times, knew every building and track and signal light by heart. But today it felt different. Today I was seeing it through Casey Morrison's eyes, a place that had rejected her, dismissed her, told her she didn't belong despite her training and talent and her father's legacy. A place where she was good enough to fix their problems in 5 minutes, but not good enough to earn a paycheck. My phone buzzed, a text from my wife Karen. "Running late. Can you pick up dinner?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Sure. Can I ask you something when I get home?" Always. Karen was a high school principal, and she'd spent her career fighting battles I was only now beginning to understand. Proving herself in a male-dominated field, dealing with assumptions about her capabilities, watching less qualified men get promoted over her. She'd told me about it many times, and I'd listened and sympathized and thought I understood. But I hadn't. Not really. Because understanding something intellectually and confronting your own complicity in it were two very different things. I drove home through the early winter darkness, picked up Chinese food from the place Karen liked, and found her in the kitchen grading papers with a glass of wine and a tired expression that I knew meant she'd had a difficult day. "Bad day?" I asked, setting the food on the counter. "Student suspension hearing, parents threatening to sue. Same old thing." She closed her laptop and poured me a glass of wine. "What about you? You sounded weird in your text." I told her the whole story, not the sanitized version I'd given Brad, but the truth. Casey's arrival, my dismissal, her fixing the locomotive, the realization of who she was, the conversation with Ray, the files in the archives, Jack's letter. I laid it all out while we ate lo mein straight from the cartons, and Karen listened, without interrupting, her expression growing more somber with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "So what are you going to do?" she finally asked. "I don't know. I know what I should do. Correct the record, find Casey and apologize. Maybe try to get her hired properly. But I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if anything could be enough." Karen set down her wine glass and looked at me with the kind of patient directness that had made her good at her job, and sometimes difficult to be married to. "Tom, do you know how many times in my career I've walked into a meeting and had my ideas dismissed, only to watch a man say the exact same thing 10 minutes later and get credit for it? Do you know how many times I've had parents ask to speak to the principal when I'm standing right in front of them wearing a name tag that says Principal Martinez? I know you've told me, I've told you, and you've listened and you've been sympathetic, but sympathy isn't the same as action. Sympathy is easy. Sympathy lets you feel bad without actually changing anything." She leaned forward. "This morning you had a choice. You could have listened to that woman, trusted her expertise, given her the respect she'd clearly earned. You chose not to, and now you have another choice. You can minimize what happened, sweep it under the rug, write your report without mentioning her, and go back to business as usual, or you can do the uncomfortable thing." "Which is?" "Admit you were wrong, publicly, not just to yourself or to me or to Ray, but to everyone. Put her name in that report. Tell Brad and regional management exactly what happened. Make sure she gets credit for her work. And then, and this is the hard part, examine why you made the choice you made and figure out how to make sure you don't make it again. That could cost me my job. If management thinks I'm unreliable, then you'll get another job. But that woman lost a job opportunity because of biases she couldn't control. She lost the chance to work in the place her father loved, doing the work she was trained to do, carrying on his legacy. Your discomfort doesn't compare to that, Tom. It doesn't even come close." She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing it and accepting it were still two different things. I spent the rest of the evening at the kitchen table, rewriting my report. This time, I told the truth. Casey Morrison's arrival, my dismissal of her, her correct diagnosis, my failure to recognize her, the fact that she'd solved in 5 minutes what my crew couldn't solve in 45. I included her qualifications, her father's recommendation letter, the fact that she'd been turned away 3 years ago. I documented my own failure as clearly as I documented her success. At 11:30 p.m., I hit send on the email to Brad and regional management. Then I sat back and waited for the consequences I knew were coming. The consequences arrived faster than I expected. Brad called me at 6:45 a.m., before I'd even made it to the rail yard. "Tom, what the hell is this report?" I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot, watching the sun rise over the freight cars, lined up like dominoes across the horizon. The coffee from the 7-Eleven near my house was cooling in the cup holder, and I'd been sitting there for 10 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside. "It's the truth," I said. "You asked for a detailed account of what happened yesterday morning. That's what I gave you." "This isn't a detailed account. It's a confession." I heard papers rustling on his end. "You're telling me that an unauthorized civilian walked onto company property, accessed restricted equipment, performed maintenance without proper certification or oversight, and you let it happen?" "I didn't let it happen. I told her to leave. She did it anyway. And then you lied about it in your initial report." "I omitted information. I'm correcting that now." "By throwing yourself under the bus." Brad's voice shifted from angry to something closer to confused. "Tom, I don't understand what you're trying to accomplish here. We had a successful outcome. The locomotive was fixed. The shipment went out on time. No one was hurt. Why are you making this into a problem?" "Because it is a problem," I said. "Because I dismissed someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and I did it based on assumptions that had nothing to do with her actual qualifications. So you made a judgment call. That's your job as a supervisor, to make judgment calls about who has access to company equipment. It was the wrong call. Maybe, but it worked out fine. So why are we still talking about it?" "Because it didn't work out fine for Casey Morrison," I wanted to say. "Because she drove away from that rail yard, having once again been told she didn't belong. Having once again had her expertise dismissed. Having once again been proven right too late for it to matter." But I didn't say that to Brad. Because Brad was part of the system, the structure, the way things had always been done. He wasn't malicious or cruel. He was just doing his job the way he'd been taught to do it. And questioning those methods felt like questioning the entire foundation he'd built his career on. I'd felt the same way 24 hours ago. "I'm just trying to give accurate information," I said finally. "What you do with it is up to you." Brad sighed. "I have to escalate this to HR. You understand that, right? You've documented multiple policy violations, including allowing unauthorized access to equipment and filing an inaccurate initial report. This is going to trigger an investigation." "I understand. You could lose your position over this." "I know." There was a long silence. Then, "Tom, is everything okay? At home, I mean. Is there something going on that's affecting your judgment?" "My judgment is fine. It's my actions that were the problem. I'm serious. If you're dealing with something, stress, personal issues, health concerns, we have resources available. But I need you to level with me here because this doesn't make sense. You're a 17-year veteran with an exemplary record, and suddenly you're filing reports that make you look incompetent at best and negligent at worst." "What would make sense to you?" I asked. "If I'd just kept my mouth shut and let the inaccurate version stand, if I'd taken credit for work I didn't do." "I'd say you were being a pragmatic professional who understood that perfect accuracy is less important than operational continuity. And I'd say that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps qualified people out of this industry." Another silence, this one heavier. HR will be in touch, Brad said finally. Don't make any major decisions until they've completed their review. He hung up, and I sat in my truck watching the rail yard come to life around me. Marcus arrived, then Ray, then the rest of the morning crew. I saw them congregating near the maintenance office, probably talking about yesterday, maybe already hearing rumors about my report. I knew what I had to do next, but the prospect filled me with a dread that was almost physical. I'd spent 17 years building a reputation in this industry, earning respect, proving I could handle the job. And now I was about to risk all of that because I'd realized too late that I'd been complicit in keeping someone else from having the same opportunity. I pulled up the number I'd gotten from Jimmy, Casey Morrison's phone number, listed on her job application from 3 years ago. I stared at it for 5 full minutes before finding the courage to dial. She answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? Ms. Morrison, this is Tom Hayes from Union Pacific. We met yesterday morning. A pause. I remember. Her voice was professional, neutral, giving nothing away. I realized I'd been hoping for anger or coldness, something that would make this easier, that would let me treat this as a transaction rather than a reckoning. I wanted to apologize, I said, for how I treated you yesterday, and for how I treated you 3 years ago when you interviewed here. I was wrong. About your qualifications, about your capabilities, about whether you belonged in this industry. I was completely wrong, and I'm sorry. Another pause. Longer this time. Okay, she said finally. Is that all? No. I've filed a corrected report with management that documents exactly what happened yesterday, including your diagnosis and repair of the locomotive. I've included your qualifications and your father's recommendation letter. I've made it clear that you did in 5 minutes what my entire crew couldn't do. And I've taken responsibility for my failure to recognize your expertise. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know, and because... I took a breath. Because I've been thinking about what my actions yesterday meant. Not just for you, but for everyone like you who's tried to break into this industry and been turned away by people like me. People who say they care about qualifications and experience, but really just want people who look and sound like the people who've always done this job. Mr. Hayes, I'm not finished. I know an apology doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back the 3 years you've lost working freelance instead of building a real career. But I want you to know that I'm trying to do better. And if there's anything I can do to help make this right, a reference, a recommendation, access to my network, I will. She was quiet for so long I thought she might have hung up. Then, do you know what my father used to tell me? No. He said that the railroad industry runs on 2 things, steel rails and stubborn pride. He said the rails are essential, but the pride is what makes everything difficult. People would rather be wrong than admit they were wrong. They'd rather maintain the status quo than accept that things could be better. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the emotion underneath it. He spent 41 years trying to change that culture, trying to prove that there was room for different perspectives, different approaches, different kinds of people. And then he died. And 6 days later I sat in your office and realized that nothing he'd done had made any difference. Casey. I'm not finished either, she said, with enough firmness that I fell silent. Yesterday morning, when you told me to leave, I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even that disappointed anymore, because I've heard it so many times that it's just background noise now. The railroad isn't for women. The railroad isn't for young people. The railroad is for the same kind of people it's always been for. And if you're not that kind of person, then too bad. I'm trying to change that. Are you? Or are you just trying to feel better about yourself? The question hit like a physical blow, because she was right to ask it. How much of this was genuine remorse, and how much was just me trying to absolve my own guilt? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe both. but I do know that yesterday I watched you do something remarkable. And my first instinct was to dismiss it, to minimize it, to act like it didn't matter. And then I spent the whole day watching everyone else do the same thing, turning you into a rumor, a story, a random event that didn't really mean anything. And I realized that's how it always happens. The system maintains itself not through active cruelty, but through passive denial, by refusing to acknowledge excellence when it doesn't come in the expected package. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line, a small sound that suggested I'd said something that resonated. "What do you want from me, Mr. Hayes?" "I want to offer you a job, or at least I want to try. I can't promise anything because I'm currently under investigation for the report I filed, and there's a decent chance I'm about to be fired. But if I have any influence left, I want to use it to get you what you should have had 3 years ago. A position here, proper training, a chance to work in your father's yard, doing the work he trained you to do. And if they say no, then I'll find somewhere else that will say yes. But I'm not going to let this drop, Casey. I'm not going to pretend yesterday didn't happen, or that you don't deserve every opportunity I've had." More silence then. "Why does this matter so much to you? You didn't care 3 years ago. You didn't care yesterday morning. What changed?" "I did," I said simply, "or at least I'm trying to. I saw myself clearly for the first time in a long time, and I didn't like what I saw. So I'm trying to be better, and I figure the least I can do is start by telling the truth and seeing where that takes me. Even if it costs you your job, even then." She laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You really don't remember the interview, do you? I'm serious. You have no memory of it at all. I remember fragments, but no, not really. I wore my father's old Union Pacific jacket, the one with his name embroidered on it. I thought maybe if you saw that, if you connected me to him, it would make a difference. But you didn't even notice. You just kept looking at your computer screen and asking your standard questions, and I could tell you'd already decided before I even sat down." I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry. Stop apologizing. It doesn't change anything." But her voice had softened slightly. "Here's what I want you to understand. I don't need your charity. I don't need you to give me a chance or help me out like I'm some kind of project. What I need is to be treated like the qualified professional I am, to be judged on my actual skills instead of your assumptions about what someone with my background can or can't do. Can you do that? Yes. And can your whole crew do that? Can your management do that? Because if I take a job there, if you somehow manage to get me hired despite everything, I'm not interested in being the diversity hire who everyone resents and no one respects. I'm not interested in spending every day proving myself to people who've already decided I don't belong. I've done that for 3 years, and I'm tired. I understand. Do you? Because here's what I've learned. People like you can have all the realizations you want, can file all the corrected reports and make all the apologies, but unless the entire culture changes, nothing really changes. You might treat me differently now, but what about the next woman who applies? What about the young Latino kid who grew up around locomotives and knows them inside out, but doesn't have a college degree? What about anyone who doesn't fit your mental image of what a railroad worker looks like? You're right, I said. All of that is true, and I don't have easy answers. But I can start by being honest about my own biases and trying to do better. And maybe that encourages other people to do the same. Maybe it starts a conversation that actually leads to change instead of just making me feel better. Maybe, she said, but she didn't sound convinced. Will you at least think about it? If I can get you a legitimate offer, not charity, not a diversity initiative, but a real position based on your actual qualifications, will you consider it? A long pause. I'll think about it, but I'm not promising anything. And Mr. Hayes, if you do manage to get me an offer and I take it and then I show up and get treated the same way I've been treated everywhere else, I will walk away and I will make sure everyone knows why. Understood? Understood. Okay then, I have to go. I've got a repair job in Laramie this afternoon. She hung up before I could say anything else. I sat in my truck with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the dead air, feeling like I'd just survived something difficult and necessary and not entirely successful. My phone buzzed again. A text from Ray. You coming in or what? Crew meeting in 10 minutes. I climbed out of the truck and headed toward the maintenance office, where I could see my crew gathered around the coffee maker. They looked up when I entered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Morning, I said. Morning, Marcus replied. The others just nodded. I poured myself coffee I didn't want and turned to face them. I need to tell you all something. Yesterday morning, after that woman fixed our locomotive, I filed an initial report that didn't give her proper credit. I've since filed a corrected report, and I wanted you to hear the full story from me before you hear it from someone else. I laid it out for them, all of it, the same way I'd laid it out in the report. Casey's qualifications, my failure to recognize her, the fact that I'd essentially taken credit for work she'd done. When I finished, the room was completely silent. That took guts, Marcus said finally, to admit all that. It's not about guts, it's about accuracy. It's about more than that, Jimmy said quietly. It's about doing the right thing even when it costs you. Ray was studying his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. What happens now? Honestly, I don't know. HR is investigating. I might lose my position. But whatever happens, I wanted you all to know the truth. And I wanted to say that I'm sorry for setting a bad example. You all deserve better leadership than what I've been giving you. Tom, Ray said carefully, you've been a good supervisor for a lot of years. One mistake doesn't erase that. Maybe not, but it reveals something I should have been paying attention to all along. And I'm going to try to be better going forward, whether that's here or somewhere else. The crew meeting ended up being shorter than usual. We went over the day's work assignments, discussed maintenance priorities, and then dispersed to our various tasks. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. People were quieter, more thoughtful, or maybe I was just more aware of how they were processing information, of what assumptions they were making about people and situations. At lunchtime, I found Jimmy in the break room again. You doing okay? He asked. Honestly? No. I feel like I've pulled a thread and my whole worldview is unraveling. That's called growth. It's uncomfortable. That's one word for it. I sat down across from him. Can I ask you something? How long have you known I was biased against hiring women? Jimmy thought about it. I wouldn't say I knew you were biased against women specifically, but I knew you had a type you liked to hire. Young guys, mostly white, usually with some kind of military or trade school background. People who reminded you of yourself when you were starting out. And you never said anything? Would you have listened? I thought about it honestly. Probably not. That's why I didn't say anything. You have to come to these realizations yourself, Tom. Someone else can't force them on you. But you could have tried, you could have pushed back when I was making hiring decisions, challenged my reasoning. I could have, but I'm not your conscience and I'm not your boss. I'm just a guy who's been around long enough to know that sometimes people need to hit a wall before they're ready to hear the truth. He leaned back in his chair. Besides, I've got my own blind spots, we all do. The best we can do is stay open to having them pointed out. Well, mine got pointed out pretty emphatically. And you listened. That's worth something. My phone rang, HR. I answered it in my office with the door closed and spent the next 45 minutes answering questions about the incident, my decision-making process, company policy, and what I'd learned from the situation. The HR representative, a woman named Patricia Simmons, who I'd only met once before, was professional but direct. "Mr. Hayes, I appreciate your honesty in filing the corrected report, but I need to be clear about the seriousness of the situation. You allowed unauthorized personnel to access company equipment. You initially filed an inaccurate report, and you've now documented multiple policy violations that could expose the company to liability. I understand. The regional management team is meeting tomorrow to discuss appropriate action. In the meantime, you're being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. I'd expected it, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the gut. For how long? That depends on the investigation. Could be a few days, could be longer. You'll be paid during this time, and you're not to discuss the details of the case with anyone except myself or members of the management team. Clear? Clear. I left the rail yard at 2 in the afternoon, which felt strange and wrong. I'd been working there for 17 years, and I'd never left early unless I was sick or taking vacation time. Walking out in the middle of the day, knowing I wasn't coming back tomorrow, felt like a kind of death. I drove aimlessly for a while, not ready to go home, not sure where else to go. I ended up at the cemetery where Jack Morrison was buried. I'd been to his funeral 4 years ago, but I hadn't visited his grave since. It took me a while to find the right section, but eventually I located his headstone. Jack Morrison, 1962-2021. Beloved father, friend, and engineer. I stood there looking at it, trying to figure out what to say. "I'm sorry, Jack," I said finally. "I'm sorry I didn't see what you saw in her. I'm sorry I let you down. I'm trying to fix it, but I don't know if I can." The wind moved through the bare trees, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle sounded, that lonesome, echoing call that had defined both of our lives. "I hope I get the chance to make this right," I said. "But if I don't, I hope someone else does. She deserves that much. She deserves everything you believed she could be." I stayed there until the sun started to set, then drove home to wait for whatever came next. The call from Patricia Simmons came 3 days later. 3 days of sitting at home, checking my phone obsessively, driving Karen crazy with my anxiety, and second-guessing every decision I'd made. 3 days of wondering if I'd destroyed my career for nothing, if Casey Morrison would even accept a job offer if one materialized, if anything I'd done would actually make a difference. "Mr. Hayes, can you come to the regional office tomorrow at 10 a.m.? The management team would like to discuss the investigation results with you." I showed up 15 minutes early, wearing the suit I usually only wore to company banquets and disciplinary hearings. Brad was already there, along with Patricia Simmons and a woman I didn't recognize. Late 50s, silver hair, the kind of sharp-eyed competence that suggested she was someone important. "Tom, thanks for coming," Patricia said. "This is Margaret Chen, VP of Operations for the Northern Region." We shook hands, and I took a seat at the conference table, trying to read the room. Brad looked uncomfortable. Patricia was professionally neutral, and Margaret Chen was studying me with an expression that could have meant anything. "Mr. Hayes," Margaret began, "we've completed our investigation into the incident of November 22nd and your subsequent report. I want to start by saying that your honesty is appreciated, even though it's created some complications for us. I understand. I'm not sure you do. Your initial report was filed with regional management and used to justify maintenance procedures and budget allocations. When you filed the corrected report, it called all of that into question. It suggested that our diagnostic capabilities are insufficient, that our hiring practices may be problematic, and that we may be overlooking qualified candidates based on biases that have nothing to do with competence." "All of which is true," I said quietly. "Yes," she agreed, surprising me. "All of which is true." And that's exactly the kind of inconvenient truth that companies like ours don't usually acknowledge until we're forced to. She pulled out a folder and set it on the table. I've been reviewing our hiring data for the past 5 years. In that time, the Northern Region has received 847 applications for maintenance and engineering positions. Of those, 127 were from women, 89 from candidates under 25, and 214 from racial minorities. Want to guess how many of those applicants we hired? I didn't want to guess. I was afraid I already knew. 7 women, all in administrative roles, 3 candidates under 25, 16 racial minorities, most of them in entry-level positions that don't lead to advancement. She closed the folder. We've been losing talent, Mr. Hayes, systematically, and we've been doing it because our hiring managers, people like you, have been selecting for culture fit over qualifications. I didn't realize... That's the problem. You didn't realize. None of our supervisors realized, or if they did, they didn't think it mattered. Because the railroad has always been a certain way, and changing it feels like betraying some kind of tradition. Brad shifted uncomfortably. With all due respect, Margaret, the railroad industry has specific demands. It's physical work. It's dangerous. It requires a certain kind of toughness. All of which women and young people and minorities are perfectly capable of, Margaret interrupted. Let me tell you a story. When I started with Union Pacific 32 years ago, I was one of 3 women in the entire regional office. People told me I wasn't tough enough, wasn't suited for the work, should consider something more appropriate. Know what I did? No one answered. I became the best damn operations manager they'd ever seen. I outworked everyone, outperformed everyone, and proved that all their assumptions were garbage. But you know what the really frustrating part was? I had to be twice as good to be seen as half as competent, and 32 years later, we're still having the same conversations. She turned her attention back to me. So here's what's going to happen. We're implementing a comprehensive review of our hiring practices across the Northern Region. We're bringing in outside consultants to audit our interview processes, redesign our job descriptions, and train our supervisors on recognizing and countering implicit bias. That's good, I said cautiously. And you're going to be part of the pilot program. I blinked. I'm sorry. You're being reinstated as yard supervisor, effective immediately. But you're also being assigned to work with the consultants to help develop the new training protocols. You're going to be the test case, the supervisor who recognized his own biases and took steps to correct them. We're going to study what you did right, what you did wrong, and how we can replicate the good parts while avoiding the mistakes. Don't understand. I thought I was going to be fired. You very nearly were, Patricia said. But Margaret made the case that what you did, admitting your mistakes, correcting the record, taking responsibility, is exactly the kind of leadership behavior we should be encouraging, not punishing. Besides, Margaret added, firing you would send exactly the wrong message. It would tell every other supervisor that honesty gets you punished and covering up mistakes is safer. That's not the culture I want to build. What about the policy violations, the unauthorized access to equipment? We've determined that Ms. Morrison's actions, while technically in violation of access protocols, were done with the intent to prevent equipment damage and shipment delays. We're adding her to our approved contractor list retroactively, which covers the liability concerns. And we're revising our protocols to be more flexible about emergency repairs. Brad was staring at Margaret like she'd grown a second head. You're saying we're just going to overlook all of this? I'm saying we're going to learn from it. Which brings me to the other decision. Margaret pulled out another document. Ms. Casey Morrison has been offered a position as senior maintenance technician with a starting salary above our usual range, full benefits, and a signing bonus to compensate for the years she spent working freelance. She'll report directly to you, Tom. which means you'll be responsible for her integration into the crew and her professional development. My heart was pounding. Has she accepted? She's considering it. Frankly, she has every reason to tell us to go to hell. But I've spoken with her personally, and I've promised her that if she takes this job, things will be different, that we're committed to creating an environment where she can succeed based on her actual abilities. And if we fail to deliver on that promise, then we'll lose an exceptional engineer, and we'll deserve exactly what we get. Margaret stood up. Any questions? I had about 1,000 questions, but only one that mattered. When will we know if she's accepted? She asked for a week to think it over. I can't blame her. This is a big decision, and she's been burned before. Margaret extended her hand. Welcome back, Tom. Try not to screw this up again. I spent the next 5 days in a state of suspended anxiety. I returned to work, briefed my crew on the situation, and spent long hours with HR consultants going over my decision-making processes and implicit biases. It was exhausting and humbling and occasionally infuriating, because they kept pointing out assumptions I hadn't even realized I was making. The crew's reaction was mixed. Ray was supportive. Jimmy was quietly pleased. Marcus was nervous about working with someone so much more experienced than him. A few of the older guys were openly skeptical, muttering about political correctness and quotas and special treatment. I addressed it head-on at a crew meeting. "Let me be clear," I said. "Casey Morrison is not being hired because she's a woman. She's being hired because she's a damn good engineer who proved her abilities when it mattered. If any of you have a problem with that, you can come talk to me directly. But I won't tolerate anyone making her feel unwelcome or treating her differently because of her gender. We all know her dad," one of the older mechanics said. "Jack was solid. If she's half the engineer he was, she'll be fine." It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but it was better than open hostility. On the 6th day, Patricia called. She accepted. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "When does she start?" "Monday, 7 a.m. I suggest you prepare your crew." Casey arrived on Monday morning in the same beat-up Ford pickup, carrying the same toolbox I remembered from that first morning. I was waiting in the parking lot, coffee in hand, trying to project a confidence I absolutely did not feel. "Morning," I said as she climbed out of the truck. "Morning." She looked around the rail yard, and I tried to see it through her eyes, the place her father had worked for 4 decades, the place she'd been rejected from, the place that was finally, reluctantly, opening its doors to her. "Listen," I started, but she held up a hand. "Before you say anything, I need you to know why I took this job." "Okay. It wasn't because of your apology. It wasn't even because of Margaret Chen's promises, though those helped. I took this job because my father loved this place. He loved the work. He loved the trains. He loved the challenge of keeping these massive machines running, and I loved hearing him talk about it. Every night at dinner, he'd tell stories about the yard, about the engines, about the problems he'd solved that day. And I'd listen, and I'd think that's what I wanted. To be part of something bigger than myself, to work with machines that mattered, to carry on what he'd started. She set her toolbox down carefully. But I also took this job knowing that it might not work out, that the culture might be too strong, the resistance too entrenched, the bias too deep. And if that happens, if I spend 6 months getting questioned and doubted and undermined, I will leave. Not because I couldn't handle it, but because life is too short to fight battles that other people should have already fought and won. I understand. Do you? Because what I need from you isn't cheerleading or special treatment. What I need is for you to treat me exactly the way you'd treat any other skilled technician. Give me challenging work, hold me to high standards, trust me to do my job. And when someone questions my abilities, back me up the same way you'd back up Ray or Jimmy or anyone else on your crew. I can do that. Then let's see if that's true. I led her into the maintenance office, where the morning crew was already gathered. The room went quiet when we entered, not hostile exactly, but wary. Everyone was watching to see how this would play out. "Everyone, this is Casey Morrison. She's our new senior maintenance technician, and she'll be working with all of you on various projects. Casey, this is Ray Kowalski, lead mechanic. Marcus Chen, junior technician. Jimmy Ortega, our veteran specialist. And Brad Hutchins from the regional office is here, observing today." Ray stepped forward first and extended his hand. "Welcome aboard. I've heard good things." "I've heard good things about you too," Casey said, shaking his hand. "My father spoke highly of this crew, said you all knew your stuff." That seemed to break some of the tension. Jimmy came forward next, then Marcus, then a few of the others. Not everyone was enthusiastic, but at least everyone was professional. "Okay," I said, pulling out the day's work orders. "We've got 3 units needing routine maintenance, 1 with a suspected fuel injector issue, and an SD-70 Mac that's been making a grinding sound in the traction motors. Casey, I'm going to pair you with Ray on the fuel injector problem. Show us what you've got." She nodded and followed Ray out to the maintenance bay. Through the window, I watched them approach the locomotive, saw Ray explaining something and Casey nodding, then saw her ask questions and point at different components. It looked like normal work. 2 technicians collaborating on a problem. It looked like the way it should have been all along. The first month was rocky. There were guys who questioned her constantly, who double-checked her work, who seemed unable to accept that she might know something they didn't. There were comments, not overtly sexist, but loaded with assumptions and skepticism. "Are you sure you can handle that? Maybe you should get Ray to look at it. That's pretty heavy. You might need help." Each time I intervened, not by fighting her battles for her, but by treating her the way I'd treat anyone else on the crew. If someone questioned her diagnosis, I asked her to explain her reasoning, and when she did, and she always did, clearly and competently, I backed her up. When someone suggested she needed help with a physical task, I pointed out that she'd been doing this work for 3 years and knew her own capabilities. Slowly, grudgingly, the crew adapted. They saw her diagnose problems accurately, make repairs efficiently, and handle emergency situations with calm competence. They saw that she didn't expect special treatment, but also wouldn't tolerate being treated as less capable than she was. And they saw me following through on my promise to hold her to the same standards as everyone else, which meant both trusting her abilities and calling her out when she made mistakes. Because she did make mistakes. Everyone did. The difference was that when Casey made a mistake, it wasn't proof that women couldn't do the job. It was just a mistake to be corrected and learned from like any other. 3 months in, we had our first real test. A locomotive broke down in the middle of winter, 20 miles outside of Cheyenne, blocking a main line during a snowstorm. Temperature was dropping fast, visibility was near zero, and we needed someone to go out there with the repair truck and fix it before the situation became dangerous. "I'll go," Casey said before I even finished explaining the situation. "It's going to be rough conditions," I warned. "Sub-zero temps, limited visibility, no backup if something goes wrong." "I know. I've worked in worse." Ray volunteered to go with her, and I watched them load up the repair truck with equipment and supplies. As they were about to leave, Casey turned back. "Tom, I need you to know something. Whatever happens out there, whether I fix this or not, I'm not going to be your redemption story. I'm not the symbol of how you changed or proof that your apology meant something. I'm just an engineer doing my job, okay?" "Okay." She nodded and climbed into the truck. 2 hours later, they radioed back, locomotive repaired, main line cleared, returning to yard. Ray's report was succinct. Casey diagnosed it in 10 minutes, fixed it in 45, textbook repair under difficult conditions. When they got back, covered in snow and grease but grinning with the satisfaction of a job well done, the rest of the crew was waiting. Not with celebration exactly, but with respect, the kind of respect that's earned through competence and proven through adversity. "Nice work," Jimmy said simply. "Thanks," Casey replied, and something in her expression suggested that those two words meant more coming from him than any formal recognition could have. 6 months after Casey started, Margaret Chen came back for a follow-up evaluation. She interviewed the crew, reviewed our productivity numbers, and assessed how the integration had gone. When she met with me at the end of the day, her expression was carefully neutral. "So," she said, "how would you say it's going?" "Honestly, better than I expected. There've been some bumps, but Casey's proven herself over and over. The crew respects her now, even the guys who were skeptical at first. And you, how have you changed?" I thought about it. I pay attention differently now. When someone walks into my yard, I try not to make assumptions about what they can or can't do based on what they look like. I question my own instincts more. I listen better. That's growth, real growth, not just saying the right words. She made a note in her file. "We're expanding the program to other yards. 3 other supervisors are going through similar training. And we're implementing the new hiring protocols region-wide. It's slow, but it's happening." Because of what happened with Casey. Because of what happened with you. You made a mistake, you admitted it, you corrected it, and you followed through on making things better. That's the model we need if we're going to actually change this culture. She stood up. "Don't let it go to your head. You're still on probation in my book, but you're doing good work, Tom. Keep it up." After she left, I went to find Casey. She was in the maintenance bay, training Marcus on a new diagnostic technique. Watching them work together, her patient explanation, his careful attention, the easy collaboration between them, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the naive kind that ignores problems, but the realistic kind that believes things can get better if people are willing to do the work. "Casey," I called out, "you got a minute?" She finished showing Marcus something, then walked over. "What's up?" "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For taking a chance on this place, for not giving up on us despite having every reason to, for being patient while we figured out how to be better." She smiled slightly. "You know, my dad used to say that the railroad is like any other machine. It needs maintenance to keep running properly. Sometimes that means fixing broken parts. Sometimes it means upgrading outdated systems, and sometimes it means teaching old components to work alongside new ones." He was a wise man. He was. And he'd be proud of what we're building here, not because it's perfect, it's not, but because we're trying. That's all he ever asked for, people who were willing to try. She went back to working with Marcus, and I stood there watching, thinking about Jack Morrison and the legacy he'd left behind. Not just in his daughter, but in the people he'd trained, the lessons he'd taught, the culture he'd tried to change one conversation at a time. I'd failed him 3 years ago, when I dismissed Casey without seeing her clearly. I'd failed him again, when I told her to leave the rail yard, instead of listening to her expertise. But maybe, just maybe, I was starting to honor his memory by doing better now. By learning from my mistakes, by creating opportunities for people like Casey, by building a workplace where talent mattered more than appearances and ability mattered more than assumptions. It wasn't redemption. Casey was right about that. I wasn't the hero of this story, and she wasn't my symbol of change. But it was progress. Real, messy, difficult progress that sometimes moved backward before it moved forward, but progress nonetheless. And in an industry built on steel rails and stubborn pride, sometimes progress was the best any of us could hope for. 2 years later, Casey was promoted to lead diagnostic engineer. She'd trained 4 other new hires, implemented a new predictive maintenance system that reduced emergency repairs by 30%. and become the person everyone went to when they couldn't figure out what was wrong with a locomotive. She was good at her job, more than good, exceptional. And now, finally, people were starting to treat her that way. But the thing I'd learned was that her success wasn't about me. It wasn't about my apology or my changed behavior or my attempts to be better. Those things mattered, sure, but they were just the bare minimum, removing obstacles that should never have been there in the first place. Casey succeeded because she was talented, dedicated, and resilient. Because she'd learned from her father and honed those lessons through years of difficult work. Because she'd refused to accept other people's limitations on what she could achieve. My job was simply to get out of her way and create an environment where her abilities could be recognized and valued. And maybe that was the real lesson in all of this. Change didn't come from grand gestures or sudden enlightenment. It came from daily choices, consistent effort, and the willingness to be uncomfortable while you unlearned old patterns and built new ones. It came from recognizing that the way things have always been wasn't a good enough reason to keep doing them that way. It came from listening to people you dismissed before, from questioning assumptions you hadn't known you were making, from accepting that you could be wrong even about things you'd believed your entire career. On a cold morning in March, I stood in the rail yard watching Casey brief her team on the day's work. She moved with confidence and authority, and her team listened because they respected her competence, not because they were being forced to. This was what Jack Morrison had envisioned all those years ago when he'd trained his daughter to be an engineer. Not special treatment, not lowered standards, not quotas or diversity initiatives, just a qualified person doing skilled work in a place that valued her abilities. Just the way it should have been from the beginning. And if it had taken me 17 years and a hard lesson to finally understand that, well, at least I'd learned it eventually. That was the thing about the railroad. It had always been about forward momentum, about laying track into the future even when you couldn't see exactly where it was going. About trust in the journey, even when the destination wasn't clear, about believing that the next mile could be better than the last one, if you were willing to do the work to make it so. I pulled out my radio. Supervisor Hayes to dispatch. All systems operational. We're ready for the morning runs. Copy that, Supervisor. Have a good day. I looked around the rail yard, at the locomotives ready to roll, at the crew preparing for their shifts, at Casey Morrison walking toward her next job with her toolbox and her father's legacy, and the hard-won respect she'd earned through competence and persistence. The sun was rising over the tracks, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. It was going to be a good day, not perfect because perfection was impossible in this imperfect world, but good. And better than yesterday, and that was enough.